Can you read the next item, please?
Item 9, resolution approving the award and execution of a $12.6 million four-year contract by the City and County of San Francisco through its Department of Elections to Sequoia Voting Systems, Inc., for the purchase of a new voting system and provision of associated voting services.
Dorrance, welcome.
Good afternoon, John Ernst, Director of Elections. Today, the Department has submitted a resolution to approve a contract with Sequoia Voting Systems for $12.6 million. It's a four-year contract with two one-year options. There's federal and state grant funding for this contract for a total of $5.8 million, and the contract would need $6.8 million in general fund support. This is a paper-based voting system, the same as we have now in San Francisco. The voters will actually have the same ballot for the elections as they use now with the current system, the ES&S system. So there won't be a big change for the voters themselves when it comes to voting in San Francisco. The difference will be there will be a touchscreen system in the polling places versus the ES&S Automark, which is a ballot marking device. The touchscreen will be used primarily for people with disabilities to be able to vote independently and privately. But again, most of the people that go to the polling places will be using the paper ballots, so there won't be a change. This contract does provide protections for the city, unlike our current contract with our current vendor. There's surety bonds for a total of $3 million for the first year, and then $1 million for the second year, and then $500,000 for the continuance of the contract. And the contract we have with ES&S, the surety bond was for $1 million until final acceptance of the system. Then there was no protection for performance to compel performance after that acceptance testing was completed. There's also severe liquidated damages in this contract that Sequoia would be penalized by. For the first year, there's a $4 million cap on liquidated damages. In the second year, there's a $3 million cap. And then the third year going forward is $2 million. Again, the contract with ES&S we have right now, they had a $1,000 or $5,000 a day penalty depending on the critical milestone that they did or did not meet in the current contract. But once the final acceptance took place, there was no protection for the city if they did not perform. If there's 10% or more of the equipment that breaks down and is not repaired within a certain time, on election day, Sequoia would have to pay damages of $175,000 each for the touchscreen and the optical scan system. If there was 10% or more of the precincts not reporting, Sequoia would be liable for $150,000 that first night on election night. There's a whole string of damages that are involved, that are incorporated in this contract that are actually unique when it comes to voting system contracts, not just in California but throughout the country. And also, the big issue with San Francisco is ranked choice voting. Sequoia plans to have its ranked choice, its voting system into the federal government for testing by May 1st. Sequoia actually has its chief engineer present today to discuss with you or provide any answers to you on the progress of the ranked choice development implementation. The contract finally calls for Sequoia to organize staff and also pay for a hand count if they don't have a certified system in place for the November election. So I can take any questions now.
Supervisor Amiano.
Thanks. One thing that nearly every advocate for voting transparency has impressed upon me in these previous weeks is that we need to disclose, Sequoia needs to disclose the source code to the Department of Elections as a matter of course. And this does seem to be very, very important, since without those codes, it is impossible to know how those votes were counted. And I don't think we can expect the public to have much faith in the electoral process. However, I'm well aware that, in talking to you as well, that there are time issues and other limitations. So could the city include an open source clause in the contract to ensure that once the open source software becomes available, we'll be automatically able to switch over?
Yes, the contractor has agreed to such a clause, and I've actually forwarded it to your office earlier today, and I've got a copy here I can give to you guys. And they're also the vendor is willing to have a third party, have the department contract with a third party to do a security and a code review and issue a report on the system as part of the contract.
And then it's been suggested the city should go even further to set up a system of source code verification subsequent to voting with Sequoia and the Department of Elections. What do you think of that?
I mean, we could oversee it potentially, but we don't have the resources and the staff to actually do the review. It would be a rather large task that would require a lot of expertise, and we could organize it, but we couldn't actually run it or implement it, I don't think.
And then what implications would such an amendment have on timelines, and could those issues be resolved at the bargaining table in a timely manner?
Well, if the contract language that has been put forward by Sequoia is accepted, then essentially the contract is done. But if there's a need to have any further negotiations on this contract, really the time is running out for us to keep going back to the contract and changing terms and thinking about what we want. We have to make a decision on what we want to do with this voting system.
And then will the Sequoia machines definitely be able to handle RCV, or could we be without a viable system when the mayoral elections roll around?
The system can't handle the ranked choice voting. They had a prototype model at the pilot program we had during the RFP process. And the engineer from Sequoia is here today to actually give a more detailed explanation of their process. I guess there's always a chance the system will not be certified for November, but at the same time, unlike other contracts we've had in the past, they're on the hook to do a hand count or find some other way to make sure that the ballots are counted in November.
And I understood that Sequoia is up for sale, and would that jeopardize any commitments?
I don't think so. I mean, since the sale has been brought up and the idea of a new owner has come into the picture, there's been no change with the service we've received from Sequoia. In fact, they're actually putting more resources into our potential contract with the ranked choice voting. So, I mean, from what I've seen so far, no.
And the ESS machines, I guess they've only been used twice?
We have two ESNS machines. One's the optical scan machine that we call the Eagle. We've had that since the November 2000 election. And then they have the AutoMark, which is a ballot marking device. We've had that for 2 elections.
Are they still working in case we need a backup?
They are. They require a lot of maintenance, but yes, they're working.
And do we really need to buy new machines? Couldn't we use the old ones for the next election cycle, since we expect that there'll be substantial changes made in the voting landscape in the near future?
Well, I made the contract for a term of 4 years on purpose because really there's not going to be any, I don't think, substantially new products coming into the voting world within the next 2 years. And even if they did, we'd have no time to bring them into San Francisco because we have 4 elections starting this November going forward to the following November. So we'd have no time to bring in a new system. And so if there was an update in technology or a change in the requirements, we'd have some leverage with Sequoia to ask them to make the changes or to provide the better equipment to us to receive the option extension from San Francisco.
So we're not locked in?
No.
In case there's changes, yeah. All right, thanks. I see Mr. Lee here, and I wondered if you wanted to say anything about this issue, and we'll turn it back to committee members and the public.
Thank you. Ed Lee, City Administrator. I'm here in the role of supporting Mr. Arntz in the election department, make sure that we do have an efficient voting system in place for not only November, but the expected election cycles to come up shortly thereafter. We have 8 months before the next election. In review with Mr. Arntz about the time frames required to change out the machines, to test them, to make sure they get certified, we're very tight on the time frame. And I would ask the committee to concern itself also, in addition to the open source, which I don't think we're opposed to, but it's the timing of this entered into the contract at this time. Had we known about this 1.5 years ago when the RFP went out, I think we would have been very agreeable to have placed it in for the fair bidding process, but we didn't do that, and I think imposing it now at this late time does cause us concern with the consequential timeframes we have to implement the machinery, the new systems, and get them certified. So I just want to place that as a real important concern on our behalf. I don't want to be here counting Chads in November, but I do want to make sure that we're doing the best we can here. And in review of this discussion with the open source, we do have the language coming from the vendor that will be willing to begin opening the door on that very serious way, and then to work with the state, Secretary of State and the task force to implement further developments of the open source public disclosure requirements.
Okay, thank you. Chair?
Well, I mean, before we go to the budget analyst, let me just say that by way of my thinking on this, I think that Supervisor Amiano, you bring up some significant issues, and I don't appreciate the insinuation that we have to rush to act on these items. I think a lot of people from the public are here. I want to hear them out. My personal druthers at this point is not to move forward with this contract without some public disclosure of technology language in the contract. I think that there are other issues around where technology is going that we need at least to think about for a moment before moving forward with a $12.5 million item. I think that there needs to be some thinking and some discussion. And the fact that Sequoia is going to take 6 plus months to get certified through the feds and the state, and we're sitting here in February looking at a November election. I mean, it seems like I'd love to be Sequoia right now. With their attorneys lurking. Looking to cash in on us. And I don't want to make the same mistake that was made by a previous Board of Supervisors, although I think Supervisor Amiano was probably around, might have been one of those lone dissenting votes, I don't know, but to purchase, voting systems that become obsolete by the time they're employed in an election here in San Francisco. So I think there's a number of issues that we need to vet, and we owe that to the public before we go spending $12.5 million of their money. With that said, Mr. Rose, do you want to? It's all right. I was going to say that whether you applaud it or not, so you don't have to do it. Ms. Newman.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Deborah Newman from the Budget Analyst's Office. As Mr. Arntz has indicated, before you is a 4-year proposed contract, $12.6 million with Sequoia. As part of the funding for this, you will be seeing before the department has introduced a separate resolution authorizing the acceptance and expenditure of the federal and state grant funds. In addition to those federal and state grant monies, on page 38 of our report, we do have a table that shows the balance of about $6.8 million of general fund revenues that will be needed over the next 4 years to support the cost of the contract. As part of this $12.6 million contract with Sequoia, I would also note that there's $750,000 to be paid to Sequoia for capital improvements for Pier 48 port property, so that the Department of Elections can enter into an agreement to rent a new warehouse. Sequoia would in turn subcontract with a construction firm to do the capital improvements, and then separately the Department of the Elections would enter into an agreement with the port to rent the warehouse. This agreement would not be separately subject to the Board of Supervisors' approval. However, you would see the cost of that lease agreement in going forward in the next year's budgets. The rental for the new warehouse is approximately $775,000 annually. Elections is currently spending about $200,000 annually for warehouse space, so that portion also will result in about additional $550,000 of general fund money going forward. So together, the proposed contract with Sequoia plus the lease, which will not again be coming separately before you, together will result in additional general fund expenditure for the city of about $9 million over the next 4 years. Therefore, our recommendation is this is a policy matter for the board to make. Thank you.
Alex, any questions for the budget analyst? Let's go ahead and take public comment. I do have some speaker cards, and since I have them, I'll read them, and if you hear your name called, you can come up to speak or line up in the middle. We'll give you 3 minutes on this item. Luis Custer, Dave Masson, Jennifer Hammond, Carol Bella.
Hi, Louise Custer, citizen of San Francisco. I've been talking to friends in the city, and I get the deep sense that people are very reassured that San Francisco would never do anything with its voting system that wouldn't bring transparency. They say, I'm sure there's going to be a paper trail, but I urge you to be sure that there is a clause in this contract with Sequoia so that we can be absolutely sure that we do have open source and access. The sale of this entity, Sequoia, may have implications, but most important is that we not allow this city of ours to have elections that aren't transparent. And as the parent of a 15-year-old young man, I would like to hope that as he goes out into the world, he can say that he is part of a San Francisco that took a lead in creating public trust in the electoral system. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Dave Masson, Democracy Action. And I also urge you today to not approve the resolution, but to refer the matter back to the Department of Elections for inclusion of the suggested open source language in the contract. Voter confidence that their votes will be counted is at a low point. That may not apply to San Francisco yet, but I think that if the resolution is passed as it stands, we're at risk of going down that road. And so, as Louise said, I hope we always call on San Francisco to provide leadership, but we always step up to the plate, and I hope that the committee will see fit to send this back for open space language, open source language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hammond. I'm with Democracy Action. I believe I emailed all 3 of you on this issue, as well as the president of my Democracy Action Club, Alec Bash. I started becoming concerned about this issue when I worked in Ohio during the 2004 presidential election for a month on voter protection with lawyers there. And I came back from there with a strong belief that we needed a big change in the way our elections would go forward from here on. And this, I believe, is a very strong, important step towards improving the system. When I was in Ohio, I worked in a boiler room on election day and fielded calls from all over the state, and did receive lots of disturbing phone calls about machines defaulting to Bush when they were trying to vote for Kerry. Technology fails. We all know technology fails, but when we're not able to go back and figure out why it failed, that is a real problem. I'm very encouraged to hear the director say in his report just now that there is a new clause that has been put into the contract. I can't comment on it because I haven't seen the clause, but I would hope that it would be something that would happen in a very timely fashion and not something that's sort of put in there and then never followed up on in the future. There is no disagreement that we need that proprietary software should be eliminated from voting systems in California. The Secretary of State has come out and said she is going to eliminate proprietary software in California. John Arntz himself has set up an open voting task force to deal with this issue because he also believes very strongly that this is the way we need to go forward. The public is very concerned about having a third-party vendor have such control over our elections and with no oversight, basically, on how the machines count the votes. Sequoia even agrees that this is something that is the way of the future and they need to address. The difference here is in timing, and we believe that it needs to happen now, and that there is no excuse for pushing it off into the future. I think Sequoia is worried about the scrutiny of the technology in their machines, and I can understand that. But if they are worried about the technology in their machines, then I'm worried. And I think that scrutiny can actually make their product stronger. It ultimately will be better for the company because they'll have a stronger product. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I thank you very much for your attention to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. After Ms. Bella, Brent Turner, Alan Deckert, Pilar Schiavo, Chandra Friese.
Hi. Good afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day. First off, I just want to say how impressed I am that you gentlemen are so knowledgeable about this issue, because I've sat at many city meetings where people are not very knowledgeable about this, and so
We all deal with elections.
I really, truly, sincerely appreciate it, and I want to just, you hit on every point, and it's like now I have to rewrite my speech here. But anyway, I originally got interested in election reform, like many other people, after watching the fiasco that we call the 2000 election, and then 4 years later seeing what happened in Ohio and being horrified, and just really getting to the point where I don't trust the results of the 2004 election. And the difference between what used to happen in elections and what happens now is that we have electronic voting machines, and they're owned by private companies with proprietary software. And to me, one of the main reasons why I got active in this movement is because unless we straighten out elections, we have nothing. We can't do any type of reform in this country whatsoever unless we have the right people who are elected by people running this country. And I think that, over the last several years, with HAVA being passed and a lot of towns and cities all over this nation, they've rushed out, and I emphasize the word rushed out, to buy voting machines owned by these 4 private companies with private software, and that we're really moving into a very dangerous area, and that we have put our elections in jeopardy. And I think you gentlemen understand that. But I'm not exaggerating today when I say to you that I believe you truly, the 3 of you, hold the future of our democracy in your hands, because San Francisco is a leader on so many levels. And today, if you send back this contract as is now and demand that we insert this open source clause, we are taking a step in the right direction to really change the way the elections in this country are run. And I think you know that what happens here in San Francisco, usually it catches on maybe a little bit later, but eventually it does. And other of my colleagues have also stated that, the new Secretary of State definitely supports the open clause, the open source. She doesn't know about the clause, but I just would really urge that let's start it here in San Francisco today, and let's see it kind of spread across the country. I, too, would like to see the clause that Sequoia now at the last minute has come up, to Mr. Arntz with. It seems like everything is kind of last minute with them. They've had over a year. They signed a letter of intent saying that they would develop RCV, and now at the very last minute we're down to signing this contract. They still don't have it. Also, with the open source clause, we've been talking about this to Steve Bennett and at the Election Commission meetings for 18 months, and now at the very last minute they come across with this clause. So I urge you to do not approve this contract unless that clause is part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Hello, my name is Brent Turner. I'm with countless voting integrity groups, San Francisco Election Integrity League, San Mateo, the same, and a lot more. We're all very concerned about this all over the country. The eyes of the country are actually upon this room today. I have complete faith in this board and the decision that you're about to make, and I appreciate and applaud you for it. We know about the certification process. We know about HAVA. We know what position we're in today. I can't express any better than Carol has the gravity in this moment, and I look to you for leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Next speaker, please.
I'm Alan Deckard. I'm the president of the Open Voting Consortium. I'd like to address a few things that Director Arndt said. One thing, he's quick to point out that it's out of the $12.6 billion, there's state and federal grants, but it's still our money. It's our money that's being spent here, and it's being spent on obsolete technology, and it's not a good deal. I think it's worth it if we get full public disclosure out of this contract, but it's not worth it if we don't. I want to also address something that the city attorney said about open source. This does not really involve reworking the technology. The clause that we're talking about is about disclosing that technology, not reworking it. We just want to shine some sunlight on this issue, not rework their technology. I would also like to address something Director Arndt said about when this might be available. I happen to be in a unique position. Arndt believes that it may not be ready by 2010 or 3-4 years from now. I can tell you that our engineers in our consortium have done 80% of the engineering for an open source system is done, and we did it for free. And it will, for legal and political reasons, it probably won't be available in California by 2008, but it will be. And it very likely will be used in other states in 2008. That is totally free open source software, a very high quality software that's been vetted by the engineering community, and it will be, I'm very certain it will be available by 2010 in the state. So making this investment now in an obsolete system is not a good bet, and I think that you might as well stick with your previous vendor, unless we get this clause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Pilar Schiavo from the San Francisco Labor Council. So on this day of love, I want to talk about something that we in labor love. We love voters. We love that those votes are counted. And so this is a very important issue to us. We are the largest get out the vote effort in San Francisco, and we want to make sure that the votes are counted. And we certainly are in support of the open code, open source voting language, and I'd also like to see that and make sure that that is something that folks who are experts on this issue have been able to have some input on. But I want to talk a little bit about the fiscal responsibility in this. I have some serious concerns about whether or not buying this Sequoia equipment is actually adding any value to what we currently have. As the speaker before me mentioned, this equipment is probably going to be obsolete, if not on the verge of it right now, in the very near future. There's a lot of new technology coming out that's being worked on currently, as well as the Secretary of State is going to be focusing on this issue and probably coming down with some new regulations soon. So why buy something that next year is not going to really do the job that we need? It's also not ranked choice voting certified, and they've been promising for a long time to be certified for RCV, and it's still not there. There's serious concerns about whether or not this will be up and running and ready to go for the November election, and we're going to need to make sure that that they're able to do that. And then overall certification, whether or not that can happen in time for the November election. So if all of this is true, that we're not really quite sure, even if we go through the contract, whether or not they're going to be ready to go in November, we're spending a whole lot of money, and we're still going to have to use the current vendor instead of moving forward with Sequoia. And as it was mentioned earlier, it's actually going to cost $550 $1,000 more a year just to house this equipment. So this is going to be a continual kind of bleed on the general fund, which we have serious concerns about, taking resources out of the general fund, which funds the other really important services that the city provides. So I just hope that you'll make those considerations and we actually oppose this contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schiavo. After the next speaker, Sasha Marini, Richard Hanson, Jane Allen, Brian Levbills.
Hi, my name is Sasha Marini. I'm a resident of San Francisco, and I'm here to talk to you about this contract. I am opposed to the contract right now as it stands, and I'm really happy to hear you supervisors talking about open source being added to the contract. I think that's necessary. But what I would prefer to see is that we wait on this purchase. This technology is going to be out of date shortly. We have a new Secretary of State, and she has pledged to examine the requirements of electronic voting systems and voting systems in general. What I would like to see is we realize that if we have 8 months until the next election, we're probably not going to have this new equipment certified that hasn't even been designed yet for ranked choice voting. And we may as well go along with what we currently have, the Eagle machines that work just fine and the Automarks that have only been used twice. Seems to me a waste of money to spend $12 million on something that still works when there's so much uncertainty about it. As far as the rush requirements, the current machines we have could be recertified. We have to go through that process. I've mentioned to the election commissions and the director of elections that we should probably start that process, given the fact that we may not have new Sequoia machines in time. So I believe that we do need to start a new RFP and scrap this one that focuses on the open source software. It's imperative that people are able to see the software that's counting their votes. When you talked about adding a clause that said when the software is available, to me that's an open-ended timeline. I don't like when it's available. If we do move forward with this, we need a clause that says that we will only purchase machines with open source software. What open source means is that everyone can look at it. That's available now. Print it out. Let us read it. It's not unavailable. It's there. We just need to see it and not have a proprietary software system. So I guess in closing, I would like to say to please not waste our taxpayer money. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
I'm Chandra Fries, San Francisco resident, and I would like to speak against proceeding with this contract in such haste and the way it's written. And I'd also like to ask some friends who have been sitting here who also are of the same mind against this contract to please stand so that we can acknowledge that even though they're not speaking, we have many citizens here that feel the same way. Thank you. We have been testifying against this Sequoia contract for 18 months. This is not new that we've shown up and talked about open source. We've been asking for this for 18 months. And now all of a sudden, we're there. And I want to express my appreciation to the board for asking the right questions. But it seems like the answers have been pretty easy to find. And I think what we're asking is to slow this down and do it right. These ranked choice voting is all of a sudden going to be ready in May. Well, it's been promised to us for over a year and never did materialize in time for the last election. And that's why the $3.5 million had to be spent in order to be HAVA compliant to buy the ES&S Automark machines. We need a plan to get the ES&S machines serviced so that they can continue. There's nothing wrong with them, so that we can slow down a little bit, get this contract done properly so that it is verifiable, and so that we have transparency and security in our elections. These contracts can be written so that they have holes and loopholes and not enough liquidated damages to worry anybody who's working on them, but we need to have them done properly, and this is going to take more than until November of '07. So our group would ask to slow down, stop this contract, take time, consult the experts in open source, and give us the transparency and security that we need in our elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reyes. Next speaker, please.
I am Jane Allen. I'm a resident of San Francisco. I was very surprised to hear that the idea of an open source code being included in the contract would be a burden at this point, because the public has been talking for months at the Elections Commission meeting about that, recommending that, asking for it, begging for it. Second is the murky issue of Sequoia, a company that is currently up for sale, as was mentioned. Sequoia is owned by Smartmatic, a Venezuelan company that is structured into an elaborate web of offshore companies and foreign trusts. The U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. announced last spring that they were looking into the issue of Sequoia's ownership. And then last December, Smartmatic announced that Sequoia was up for sale, which ended the committee's investigation of the matter. Another issue. On October 14, 2005, 10 months after Smartmatic purchased Sequoia, Antonio Mujica, CEO of Smartmatic, was refused entry into the U.S. His visa was revoked by the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. Maybe my nose is just too sensitive, but all of this just doesn't pass the sniff test for me. Would you contract with a company that is currently for sale and has this kind of history to, say, remodel your home or provide software and computer equipment for your business? Would you write them a check feeling confident that they would deliver on their promises 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years? This contract is for $12.5 million. You can send it back to Mr. Arntz and say, no, we can do better than this. Changing it to an open source code requirement, I think, is the very least that you can do to protect the people of San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Next speaker, please.
My name is Richard Hanson. I'm a resident of San Francisco. At the outset, I think that we should convey to Mr. Arntz that this steady succession of people up here are really not trying to pick on him, and that the reason we've taken this afternoon to speak at this time is that we really believe elections are important. Now, I personally have been voting myself for almost 60 years, but it's only been the last 5 or 10 years that I have come to recognize that casting a ballot is not always as sure, and I'm less confident about the validity of my ballot. I join with the other people who've spoken in the sense that there's no great urgency to get this contract written with a particular vendor within the next year or two. I think it's a nationwide problem that has not been dealt with in the proper way by the United States government, but we need to have a very, very transparent, honest form of voting in the city of San Francisco and around the country. Now, this notion of rushing out and getting our contract done really, really quick so we can make some sort of artificial deadline, I think is fallacious. And I would commend the members of the subcommittee to pick up their 14th of February Wall Street Journal, which maybe you don't read it every day, but right on the front page there's an article by Vanessa Fairmans, F-U-H-R-M-A-N-S, entitled "Fights Over Health Claims Spawn a New Arms Race." And the essence of that is that the software being used by insurance companies and Medicare and other agencies to reimburse doctors and hospitals for medical claims is screwed up. And it suffers from a lack of transparency, so that the doctors, the hospitals, really can't understand what the payments are based on. And if you've ever been on Medicare and tried to submit a Medicare claim for yourself or your elderly grandparents, it's a real bitch. And there needs to be transparency in all of these things. But I don't think there's a great urgency to get this contract done, and I think we should hold out until it's become transparent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. After the next speaker, Roger Donaldson, Barbara Commons, Lee Munson, and West.
Hi, my name is Brian Lubitz. I am a constituent of Supervisor Dufty. And I also run a blog about California politics. I've been following these issues for quite a while. I guess the first thing I'd like to go over real quick is the recent announcement of vote flipping, which was hacking by a professor at Princeton University, was able to actually flip votes on Sequoia machines. So obviously, I'm extremely concerned about having Sequoia machines in the city, and also I'm concerned about giving $9 million of general fund money to a company that has not really proved its worth to the country and to the voting system in general. Open source would be a great start. I would actually prefer that we stick with the current vendor and wait until we get open source software in general, rather than trusting Sequoia's because of the past history of the vote flipping. So I want to thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lubitz. Next speaker, please.
Hi, members of the board. I'm Barbara Cummins, a resident of San Francisco, and I volunteered as a citizen observer in 2004 and 2006. This is an important matter for San Francisco government as well as San Francisco voters. I think it's fair to say most San Franciscans no longer take their vote for granted. I'm here to encourage you to come up with the most up-to-date equipment and process with open source code and a paper ballot copy to back up the electronic system. If we can't have this in the pending Sequoia contract, then let's wait. Use ES&S for a couple more years until open source code is available. This makes good fiscal sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Commons. Next speaker, please.
Roger Donaldson had to go, so I'm Lee Munson. Been active as election volunteer the last 2 elections, observing, and I'm also a city commissioner. And I've been working with a group that is studying election integrity pretty carefully. I'm concerned that we're rushing to grab something that isn't all that good a deal for us. The Sequoia machines are older technology, and as several people have mentioned, we have new Secretary of State. There are new regulations coming out of Washington. And Sequoia still lacks ranked choice voting. And as has been mentioned, they promised several times, 3 times that I know of, that they would definitely have it by a certain date under a contract. Each time, they flubbed. If they claim they're going to produce ranked choice voting and don't get it done, and they get close to the election, what are we going to do? We're going to have to go through a mad scramble. I think it's much better to take our time. ES&S has technology that has worked. The Secretary of State has approved it in the past. I can't imagine that she would refuse to approve it for 1 or 2 more elections. I was one of a group of people that are here that campaigned for Deborah Bowen and kind of know her thinking. She really wants to clean up our problems with elections. Having a voting machine vendor promise to release source code sounds very much to me like a company that promises to have ranked choice voting. It just doesn't make sense. And think about this. If we spend this money, and some people are saying, well, it's just federal and state money. Turns out there's quite a bit of local money, too, $9 million. But if we spend this money that we would get from the feds and the state, we're using up our HABA allotment. Counties in Florida that got these touchscreen voting machines that had no paper trail are now finding they have to come up with their own money to buy replacement equipment. This is still a pig in a poke. This is development stage software. It could take a couple of years before it really functions. This is not the kind of a horse you want to bet on when we got an election race coming up in November and another one in November 2008, an important election in 2008. So if worst comes to worst, we'd be better off having ballots, paper ballots, except for people who are blind, but have paper ballots for everybody. There are other technologies available for blind people that do not require a contract with Sequoia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
So save our $12.6 million. Okay.
After the next speaker, Tim Mayer and Stephen Hill. Ms. West?
I'm just going to read a quote to you just briefly from your budget document. It says here on page 24 at the bottom, the Elections Department is projected to end the year with a $1 million deficit. This projected deficit is due to paying approximately $1.2 million for additional ballot costs for November, for the last November election, less a partially offsetting savings of $0.20 million in projected salary costs. So what that says is that the Elections Office is cutting back on salary. It's not hiring the people it needs. It's using the money for ballots. I would like to make two recommendations. I would like to recommend that the money be spent on hiring and training citizens as poll workers and election officials, and not leaving the scanning of ballots to electronic voting company machine company representatives as occurred in November. And due to the lack of funds, it was commonly known in the activist community. And the second recommendation is that the security of the warehouses where the machines are stored has to be worked on, because from what I heard at the Elections Commission meeting last week, there's practically no security, and that strikes me as a very unusual thing. That's where the money should be going. Those two things: hiring and training, building in more security into the warehouse. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. West. Next speaker, please.
Tim Mayer, I'm with San Francisco District 8. First of all, I wanted to thank you for listening, since this is only, foundational to our democracy. So the first thing is, with respect to priority code, what I'm hearing is that you want to know what the count is, but you absolutely do not know. And unless you have access to the source code so that you can read it, and that, access to be read by experts, you just don't know. So until that occurs, until you have source code that is either proprietary and disclosed or open source, you're just not going to know. So until you have it, you don't know. The other thing is that today we had a speaker, Alan Deckard, and he happens to be an expert that's been working on this, has worked in the voting systems registrar's office and so on. And he's here to answer all of your questions with respect to transparency, disclosure, open source, and the distinctions and all of that between what they mean and so on, so that there's no confusion with respect to any of those issues about voting systems. And it would be great if you would avail yourselves of his information, because he's available here today. And again, I want to thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Hill?
Stephen Hill. Thank you, supervisors, for holding a hearing about this very important issue. What hasn't been mentioned today is that about a year ago we went through a very similar situation, you might recall, where things were we were rushing, trying to get all the necessary certifications. And at that time, in your infinite wisdom, you chose to pass a law to deal with this situation in the future. And Section 980 of the San Francisco Code now has a law called Preparation of Backup Plan Contracts for Voting Equipment. Perhaps it's become an insignificant clause that no one's aware of, but I just want to quote to you from this law that you passed. In fact, all three of you voted for it. It was a 10-1 vote in favor of this law. The Department of Elections shall prepare a backup plan for any election for which the voting system that the Department of Elections intends to use in compliance with the San Francisco Charter and state law at that election is pending certification from the California Secretary of State. So this law requires the Department of Elections to develop a backup plan. As far as I know, at this point, a backup plan does not exist. There's been some mention of using ES&S as a backup plan, or potentially as a hand count backup plan. But the thing to know about using ES&S as a backup plan is that You can't just, give them a call one day and say, okay, we want to use you, say, in May or June. That at a certain point, ES&S is going to pull out of San Francisco. They're going to take all the equipment out of the warehouse. They're going to close down the warehouse. They're going to reassign their employees to another part of the country. They actually will physically remove some of the parts from their voting equipment that is in there now that allows us to do ranked choice voting because it's proprietary equipment. And so if you don't let ES&S know by, I would say, mid-March to late March, probably at the latest, that San Francisco wishes to use them, that as a backup plan will be gone as an option. And then you will pretty much be left with a hand count. And, a hand count in a mayoral election could be interesting to say the least. The law that you passed... Many
weeks of excitement downstairs in the
It'll be dramatic. The law that you passed then also goes on to say, in addition, when considering the approval of a contract for voting equipment, the Board of Supervisors shall give great consideration to whether that equipment complies at the time of signing the contract with the San Francisco Charter and has gained all necessary certifications from the California Secretary of State. So, I hope that you will keep this in your mind as you consider these things. I am concerned about the issue of open source. I think there are ways to deal with that. Open source, I think, is something that is clearly coming. But there are other things we could do short of open source if we are confident with other things about the voting equipment, and perhaps if there's a longer time for figuring these things out, and we didn't have such a short time frame, we could certainly entertain some of those. But my main point is I would like you to keep in mind that you did pass this law last year as a result of a similar situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Is there any other member of the public that wishes to comment on this item, item number 9? I have noticed that no representative from Sequoia has commented, and I think I'd be interested in at least getting one question answered. There may be others.
Stephen Bennett was representing Sequoia Voting Systems.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for
Thank
coming. I can't speak for the entire committee yet, but we have a process that speaks for the committee. But I'm not prepared to move forward with this contract language without some public disclosure of your technology within the contract. Are you willing to include that?
I'm sorry,
Are you willing to include it? Because we probably could do something like give approval from committee contingent on some specific language but it's a contract, so you'd have to agree to it.
Well, we're willing to discuss this. We have taken a position, and I have spent the last 6 months attending the election commissions as I was handed over the responsibilities of handling the contract with San Francisco. And I completely understand and hear the community. And I'm bringing a company that has 100 years of election industry work to a point now that we've reached out to the Secretary of State, looking forward to working with her on her goals and her plans to bring the voters of California much more comfortable with the voting process. So her plan, whether it's to disclose our source code, whether it's for her to review the code, we've agreed to talk to her about that and through the process. And if the same thing goes, as we...
I hear you, and I appreciate that. I'm just to cut to the chase here. For me, I have some language I can perhaps read it, and you can, but I think you know what I'm talking about. I'm willing to, despite the concerns raised by Mr. Hill and others, Ms. Schiavo from the Labor Council, which I think have some merit, I'm willing to, move forward with this contract, notwithstanding the technological issues, notwithstanding the backup issues, if there are strong public disclosure language in the contract, and that's. Well, but if there's not an agreement, then it's sort of.
We're very willing to discuss the process, and we have true concerns about the specific language that the Open Voting Consortium has proposed to us. And so and I leave it as that. I mean, if
My language that I was thinking about was a little bit stronger than OVC's language, but, we can have that discussion.
Well, the city attorney has proposed, and the Department of Election proposed to us some language that we agreed to today that was forwarded to you. And that may or may not be as far as you want to go.
No, that's nice, but at a certain point, you're now having the direct dialogue with the policymakers.
I understand.
So,
Well, I'm here.
You don't go through these elections to come here and, not engage in the policy discussions. There's got to be some upside to going through the elections. And this is it. This is what we get for going through that. Colleagues, one potential way out is maybe not a great answer, but maybe more's been done in less time. We have a week, which this item doesn't really have any need to move or not necessarily move today, because we have no full board scheduled next week, and we do have a committee hearing scheduled next week. One thing we can do is continue this item for a week. The downside is sometimes people feel like they have to come back to give more public comment, and sometimes it sounds very same to the comment that you made today, which I thought was compelling, and maybe compelling enough to make identical public comment 1 week from today, but maybe also not necessary to do that, because I think the committee heard members of the public. Colleagues, I'd perhaps entertain a motion for a 1-week continuance, and certainly my office would be open to Director Arntz and representatives of Sequoia to figure out if there's, into the advocates, to figure out if there's an actual movement on this, and then, on the other stuff, I mean, if there isn't, maybe it's not worth rolling the dice on, the certification.
If we have that breathing room, I think that's not such a bad thing. So, a 1 weeker.
Is that a motion?
I'll make a motion.
All right, we'll see you next week without objection.
Thank you, Supervisor. 1
week. Yeah. We're meeting next week.
Yeah.
You coming? All right, we'll you going to Disneyland? Supervisor Dufty will be in Disneyland.
Yeah, do they vote there? I vote for, it's goofy.
You can tell us if they have open source in Tomorrowland. Madam Clerk, can you read, how about, let's do both the last items.